The ghetto. The ghetto. The ghetto? How do we get ghettos? Why do we even have ghettos? Why are they associated with black people? And are they a thing that happened by accident? Or were they created on purpose? These are the things that runs through my mind when I think about the violence, poverty, and overall slum conditions that gets glorified with American ghettos. So I decided to do some research to get some answers. And what I found out blew my mind. So in this video, I will take a look at housing segregation in order to explain how the creation of American ghettos through government policy has perpetuated the image of black Americans as being violent, poverty-stricken people. The major reason we have ghettos in this country is because federal, state, and local governments purposely created racial boundaries through racist policies. And these policies range from different levels. There are policies pertaining to loans to buy housing, preventing you from moving into certain neighborhoods, and keeping you trapped in undesirable locations. So, to begin with, let's look at the federal level with the Public Works Administration. The PWA was created from the New Deal to deal with public housing for the civilian population. However, it had an explicit segregation policy that said public housing could only be used to house people of the same race in the same neighborhood in which it was located. This was horrible because not only did it segregate future public housing, it also destroyed previously integrated ones by building segregated ones right on top of them. Ultimately, the PWA created racial segregation where none existed before. Moving on, as the PWA continued housing segregation for both white and black families with separate projects and separate buildings in public housing, the Federal Housing Administration took charge in segregating housing during the increase of home ownership through suburbanization. Suburbanization, the creation of the suburbs, was financed by the Federal Housing Administration starting in the 30s and then going on through the 40s and 50s. They gave builders concessionary loans through banks. They basically guaranteed lower interest rate loans for banks so that the developers could use to build the suburbs. But it was on one condition, that no homes in the suburbs could be sold to black families. They also provided model language attached to the deeds that builders could use to ensure that no purchaser could resell to an African American. An example of this are covenants, which were enforced at the local level by city government. What type of covenant prohibited the owner of the home from reselling the home to a person who was not Caucasian? They would prohibit anyone else from residing in their home, as in they couldn't rent to an African American. The other type of covenant was an agreement between neighbors, typically organized by a neighborhood association, in which any neighbor would have the right to sue to have evicted an African American who purchased any home in the neighborhood. Furthermore, this precedent set by the Federal Housing Administration not only affected the black civilian population, but it also affected the black military population. After World War II with the GI Bill, veterans returning home had the option of buying relatively cheap and affordable housing. This led to a lot of working class and middle class home ownership that led to a lot of equity and became the basis of a lot of upward mobility for working class and upper class people. But black families were denied that option because the Veteran Administration used the same manuals that the FHA used for requiring that black families not be approved for loans if they were in an integrated neighborhood or if there were any African Americans living nearby. Moreover, all the construction jobs that built the suburbs in this country were close to African Americans because the construction unions prohibited them from being members. In essence, suburbanization wasn't just a housing program, it was also an employment program. African American civilians and veterans were not only prevented from participating in the housing boom that led to the building of generational wealth through home ownership, but were also denied equal employment rights that added to a lot of equity and allowed for upper class mobility by these racist, segregationist government policies. Moving on, when these overt, racist, segregationist government policies became unconstitutional, new sort of ones were created to keep black families in public housing in out of white neighborhoods. An example of this is redlining. Redlining was enforced by banks and lending institutions, and in it, they wouldn't issue mortgage loans in African American neighborhoods. The term redlining comes from the fact that the maps used would color in red African American neighborhoods to determine where not to issue loans. With this in mind, I can't forget to credit our friends at the Federal Housing Administration because they're the main culprit here. They created the black neighborhoods, made it easy for banks to isolate them, and were the main reason that banks didn't issue loans in African American neighborhoods. Because the banks knew that the FHA wouldn't insure the loans if offered to black families. All hope seemed lost. These racist, segregationist government policies were doing numbers on the black community, but it wasn't over yet. We had real estate agents who were the boots on the ground, doing the Lord's work, stopping and dismantling these policies and housing segregation. Of course, I'm being sarcastic, but in fact, real estate agents did combat housing segregation in their own greedy way through blockbusting. In blockbusting, they will come to a neighborhood where a single African American might have purchased a home in violation of a racial covenant. Then they will try to convince white families in the neighborhood to sell their homes. After selling their homes, the real estate agents would then turn around and resell the homes to African Americans. On the surface, this looks like a positive, since black families were finally able to integrate into white neighborhoods. But this came at a price of the image of black Americans being tarnished. Real estate agents would spread propaganda that black families would drop the property values of a neighborhood if they moved in to white families. The propaganda was believable because African Americans had a negative image as being slum dwellers who didn't maintain their homes and brought disorder to a community when they've lived there. However, those slum characteristics were not of black families, but of government policy. After all, government policy did create the ghettos. They denied adequate services, frequently ignored garbage collection and building maintenance, and create disorder by limiting the supply of housing outside the ghettos to black families, causing overcrowding. Regardless, when black families did manage to break out those slums and buy a home in a neighboring area, white families were persuaded by real estate agents that they would bring the slum conditions to their neighborhoods. Moreover, real estate agents will use other dirty tactics to trick white families into selling their homes. They will recruit blacks from the ghettos to walk around the neighborhoods and push baby carriages, and will phone call white families and ask for names that were stereotypically black. These techniques would send white families into a panic and trick them into selling their homes at a cheap price. After the house is sold to them, real estate agents would then turn around and resell the homes to African Americans at a higher price. Since they bought the homes at a higher price, it would take black families a longer time to build wealth through home ownership. Nonetheless, integration happened. Alright, I know that's a messed up way for it to happen, but at least some black families were able to get out the ghettos government policy created and become successful homeowners living in decent neighborhoods. So one would think everything was headed towards a positive direction, right? Nope. In a capitalist society, there will always be greed, and people stand to gain off the loss of others. Eventually, black homeowners became victims to bankers' greed with subprime loans. Subprime loans were popular before the housing bubble burst and the stock market collapsed in 2008. They were marketed to black homeowners by banks like Wells Fargo as low-interest loans. As a result, black families gave up their existing mortgages for an initial low teaser rate, thinking they had a good deal. However, they didn't realize that they had made a deal with the devil until after the housing bubble burst and the stock market collapsed in 2008. The interest rate had exploded. There were enormous prepayment penalties if they tried to get out of it, and many of them couldn't pay or refinance these mortgages. Ultimately, they lost their homes to foreclosure and were pushed back into the ghettos, living in apartments and tenements in much denser neighborhoods after being homeowners. So in conclusion, government policy of housing segregation created the ghettos. It is important to know this because you understand why black people are seen as violent, poverty-stricken people, but in reality, the housing segregation caused by these government policies made black people miss out on the housing boom, which led to generational wealth. This missing out of the housing boom also caused the income gap between white and black families, and also being put in the ghettos has created slum conditions for black people to where there is little maintenance when it comes to infrastructure, there is little home ownership, and there is a lot of overcrowding. So these conditions and also being restricted from living in other areas has caused violence because the residents of these areas see no way out but to take risks. And the education and the understanding of this matter has not been spread out. So there's a misconception that black people are the ones that created these conditions. So I hope you learned something new today, because it is a cautionary tale to show you that how deeply rooted these government policies are and how much damage they have done to the image of black people in America. So if you learned something new today, like it. If you learned something new today, comment. If you learned something new today, share. And I hope you like this video, and thank you.